All right, team, here we are. We got a short section today. It is, I think it's just chapter 38. Chapter 38 and 39, but it's only like 5 pages. So I'll make sure you have multiples up if you want to read farther. Stanley took hold of Zero's forearms and pulled him upright. Then he stooped down and let Zero fall over his right shoulder. He stood up, lifting Zero's worn-out body off the ground. He left the shovel and sack of jars behind as he continued up the mountain. Zero's legs dangled in front of him. Stanley couldn't see his feet, which made it difficult to walk through the tangled patches of weeds and vines. He concentrated on one step at a time, carefully raising and setting down each foot. He thought only about each step and not the impossible task that lay before him. Higher and higher he climbed. His strength came from somewhere deep inside himself, and he also seemed to come from the wall outside as well. What? I didn't read that right. His strength came from somewhere deep inside himself, and also seemed to come from the outside as well. There we go, no wall. After focusing on Big Thumb for so long, it was as if the rock had absorbed his energy, and now acted like a kind of giant magnet pulling him toward it. After a while, he became aware of a foul odor, like a bad smell. At first he thought it came from Zero, but it seemed to be in the air, hanging heavy all around him. He also noticed that the ground wasn't as steep anymore. As the ground flattened, a huge stone precipice, a precipice is something that sticks up, rose up ahead of him, just barely visible in the moonlight. It seemed to grow bigger with each step he took. It no longer resembled a thumb. He knew he'd never be able to climb it. Around him, the smell became stronger, and it was a bitter smell of despair, of sadness. Even if he could somehow climb the Big Thumb, he knew he wouldn't find water. How could there be water at the top of a giant rock? The weeds and bugs survived only by an occasional rainstorm, like the one he had seen from camp. Still, he continued toward it. If in nothing else, he wanted to at least reach the thumb. He never made it. His feet slipped out from under him, and Zero's head knocked against the back of his shoulder as he fell and tumbled into a small, muddy gully. As his face lay down in the muddy ditch, he didn't know if he'd ever get up again. He didn't know if he'd even try. He had come all this way just to... You need water to make mud. He crawled along the gully. A gully is just like a little, path. In the direction that seemed to be muddiest. The ground became gloopier. The mud splashed up at him as he hit the ground. Oh my gosh, the mud splashed up as he slapped the ground. I can't read today. Using both hands, he dug a hole in the soggy soil. It was too dark to see, but he thought he could feel a tiny pool of water at the bottom of his hole. He stuck his head in the hole and licked the dirt. He dug deeper, and as he did so, more water seemed to fill the hole. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, first with his fingers, then with his tongue. He dug until he had a hole about as deep as his arm is long. Then there was enough water for him to scoop out with his hands and drop on Zero's face. Zero's eyes remained closed, but his tongue poked out between his lips and searched out the droplets. Stanley dragged Zero closer to the hole. He dug, then scooped more water and let it pour out of his hands into Zero's mouth. As he continued to widen his hole, his hand came across a smooth, round object. It was too smooth and too round to be a rock. He wiped the dirt off of it and realized it was an onion. He bit into it without peeling it. The hot, bitter juice burst into his mouth, and he could feel it all the way up to his eyes. When he swallowed, he felt its warmth move down his throat and into his stomach. He only ate half and gave the other half to Zero. Here, eat this. What is it? Zero whispered. A hot fudge sundae. All right, so we found some water and onions. All right, think back in the book. Why do we know that onions are important? What else have we learned about onions so far in this book? Okay, think about it. Chapter 39. Stanley awoke in a meadow, looking up at a giant rock tower. It was layered and streaked with different shades of red, burnt orange, brown, and tan. It must have been over 100 feet tall. Stanley lay awake a while just looking at it. He didn't have the strength to get up. It felt like his insides of his mouth and throat were coated with sand. And no wonder. When he rolled over, he saw the water hole. It was about 2.5 feet deep and over 3 feet wide, and at the bottom lay no more than 2 inches of very brown water. His hands and fingers were sore from digging, especially under his fingernails. He scooped some dirty water into his mouth and switched it around, trying to filter it with his teeth. Zero moaned. Stanley started to say something to him, but no words came out of his mouth, and he had to try again. "How are you doing?" It hurt to talk. "Not good," Zero said quietly. With great effort, he rolled over and raised himself to his knees. He crawled to the water hole, lowered his head into it, and lapped up some water. Then he jerked back, clutched his knees to his chest, and rolled to his side, and his body shook violently. Stanley thought about going back down the mountain to look for the shovel so he could make a water hole deeper. Maybe that would give him cleaner water. They could use the jars as drinking glasses. But he didn't think he had the strength to go down, let alone to make it back up. And he didn't know where to look. He struggled with his feet. He was in a field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to extend all the way around the big thumb. He took a deep breath and walked the last 50 yards to the giant precipice, the giant rock, and touched it. "Tag, you're it." Then he walked back to Zero in the water hole. On the way, he picked one of the flowers. It actually wasn't a big flower. It wasn't one big flower, he discovered, but instead each flower really had a tiny cluster of little flowers that formed a round ball. He brought it to his mouth, but then had to spit it out. He could see part of the trail he had made the night before when he carried Zero up the mountain. If he was going to head back down and look for the shovel, he realized he should do it soon, while the trail was still fresh. But he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid Zero might die while he was gone. Zero was still laying doubled over on the side. "I gotta tell you something," he said, with a groan. "Don't talk. Save your strength." "No, listen," Zero insisted. Then he closed his eyes, and his face twisted with pain. "I'm listening," Stanley whispered. "I took your shoes," Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. His shoes were on his feet. "That's all right," he said. "Just rest now." "It's all my fault," said Zero. "It's nobody's fault," said Stanley. "I didn't know," Zero said. "That's okay," Stanley said. "Just rest." Zero closed his eyes, but then again he said, "I didn't know about the shoes." "What shoes?" "From the shelter." It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend. Clyde Livingston's shoes? "I'm sorry," said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero was delirious. Zero's confession seemed to bring him some relief. The muscles on his face relaxed as he drifted into sleep, and Stanley softly sang him the song that he had been in his family for generations. If only the woodpecker sighs. The bark on the tree was a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely. He cries to the moon, if only, if only. Okay, so that's what we've got so far, right? I want you to pause there, go to Teams, answer your questions, and then be thinking, right? What do you think is happening here? What onions did we find, right? And then how is Zero involved with these shoes? Why is Zero apologizing for the shoes? What do you think happened? All right, team, we've got 5 sections left. So I'll get those up to you soon. Have a great day and goodbye.